Hello, anyone and everyone who's out there on YouTube, and welcome to the Professor's Podcast. I'm Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is Greg Melleuish. Greg, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. You've got your Fez, and I've got Doctor Who.
we're pop culture geniuses. I want to talk to you about the history wars. Now, I'm going to show a article, if the screen
Yeah.
share works. This is your latest in Quadrant magazine in the January-February issue, reviewing the history wars. And it's where I found out about the details of the history wars. I had heard the term, but I didn't really know that it wasn't just a pop culture term, that there actually was the history wars. So why don't you tell us all what the history wars was, and then we'll go get into what it is now.
Oh, you've got that up the top. I prefer.
Yeah.
Oh, I can see myself now. That's better. That's better. That's better. Well, the history wars was primarily, I suppose. I mean, Keith Windschuttle, of course, was a big um, uh, player in all of this, and what really got the history wars going, I suppose, in Australia was when he wrote his series of books on what was it, the fabrication of Aboriginal history. I think one of them was. I think it was called. And he went through the evidence and said there hadn't been as much massacres and violence and so on as perhaps the proponents of the genocide case would have us believe. Of course, the evidence in this regard is very, very hard to track down because,
Right.
a lot of it would have taken place and wouldn't have been reported. So it's very hard to know exactly what happened in this regard. So he got savagely attacked, particularly by certain academics, including Professor McIntyre, because they thought he had no right really to have a say in these things because he wasn't, quote unquote, a professional historian. So one of the things that McIntyre did in the early part of this century was to put the history wars very much in the frame of professional academic historians who know what they're doing versus amateur non-professional historians who we shouldn't take seriously.
The great irony
that's a classical sort of thing. I mean, historians and people in other disciplines have long done this sort of thing. If someone comes from outside with a view that doesn't quite fit the academic orthodoxy, then the academics tend to form a bit of a phalanx around and to fight these people off.
The great irony there is that Keith Windschuttle, who's the editor of Quadrant magazine now, he actually is a professional historian, whereas Stuart McIntyre, the opposite in this debate, is an academic historian.
Academic historian.
Well, a professional economist is one who works at a bank downtown. An academic economist is one at a university.
I think in Australia, professional means academic. I think when people say professional, they mean academic.
I just think it's fun. I know that that's what they mean, but it is a bit funny to claim that mantle when a professional engineer is one who builds bridges. An academic engineer is one who teaches engineering. But the historians, and well, I guess you're an historian as well. But historians seem to have claimed this. We're the professionals, and those we have taught who've gone on to careers in writing history, they're the amateurs.
Well, yeah, but it is it's an older sort of conflict. There are other people who have been caught in this sort of trap as well, and to a certain extent, the academic historians do have a responsibility when utter rubbish comes out of the non-academic world to say something. So for example, a number of years ago, I did an article on Gavin Menzies. You've come across Gavin Menzies?
No, I don't know Gavin Menzies.
He's dead now. He's a former submarine, Royal Navy submarine commander who
right.
wrote this book called 1421, The Year China Discovered the World. And it argues that, I can't pronounce his name, Zheng He or whatever it is anyway.
I've heard the argument. I didn't attach it
Yeah,
to the name.
he didn't just go around the Indian Ocean, which we know he did,
Right.
but actually visited North America,
Right.
sailed up the Thames, visited Australia, and everybody looked at this and said it's rubbish. But hey, it was rubbish that sold 1 million copies.
everyone looks at my work and says it's rubbish, and I don't even have the sales to back it up.
Well, you know, and there are. I mean, the article was done with I did half the article. The other half of the article was done about this. What's his name? Anatoly. There's this Russian mathematician who's completely rewritten the chronology of history so that ancient Athens basically took place in the Middle Ages and all other sorts of weird and wonderful things. So there is work out there which is decidedly odd. It's like all the stuff you get on YouTube about ancient aliens in Samaria and so on. And so there is a certain thing that says, hey, I don't really want this. We have some responsibility to say, but on the other hand, that's not the case with Keith. He's very scrupulous because he is a former journalist, and he said, well, what historians do is they should actually look at the evidence. What evidence do we have? Well, historians generally work with written evidence. So the written evidence is your first port of call, and there's a real problem with a lot of the stuff on Aboriginal history. Often relies on oral evidence. Stories that have been handed down. So how do you evaluate those sorts of stories? They're very, very difficult to deal with. And I can recall an Australian Historical Association meeting in 2004. This was about the time of my article, my first article on McIntyre, which really upset everybody, in which all these supposedly sober academics were sitting around saying, how are we going to get Windshuttle? How are we going to get him? How are we going to totally discredit him? Yeah. It was really quite frightening, I can tell you. You think, wait, academics, they're engaging in mob behavior. That's what it was like.
Keith, I hope you're watching, and if you are, get in the comments and let us know what you think. I'll put it on screen. But Greg, I want to go back to your article, because when I said, I hadn't heard of the history wars, I meant the History Wars. That is the book.
Oh, the book.
Stuart McIntyre. And I'm assuming that Stuart McIntyre we're looking at there in this photo on Quadrant Online. And your initial foray into this was, as I understand it, a opinion piece in the Australian.
Yes, that's right.
Criticizing the History Wars. So what was the History Wars in italics, and why did you see fit to go to war on it?
Why did I see it fit to go to war on? Well, the History Wars was a book written by Stuart McIntyre with some help from Anna Clark. So it wasn't just him, but he was as they would say, the lead author of the book. And the story is actually quite simple. I think I've written it down somewhere. I came across a copy in the bookshop at work, and I thought, I'll read through this. And one of the things I noticed in the book was that that McIntyre had misspelled Salazinski, my friend Imre Salazinski's name. And I thought, this is great. This is the historian Stuart McIntyre, who is rather sort of very particular about. I'd once been criticised in a review he did because I'd misspelt someone's name, and he was doing exactly the same sin, so to speak. So I emailed Imre and said, he's misspelt your name. And somehow it all ended up with Tom Switzer, who was then the opinion editor of the Australian, and he said, "Oh, would you like to do a piece on this?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll do a piece. And what really got me about the book at the time was that here was Stuart McIntyre, and he was the person who wanted to promote himself as the leader of the Australian historical profession, and he got lots of sort of patronage from the government. And he was turning around and criticising the government for being so dreadful to Australian history. I thought, hey, there's a bit of hypocrisy going on here, perhaps. Maybe there's a bit of hypocrisy. And what I did in the article was to point out how powerful he was. He was extremely powerful. And you have to understand, in a country like Australia, where academia is not very big, and even in a discipline like history, it's possible for a very small number of people to control the discipline.
Right.
So there was an article written back in the 1990s, I think, about the small number of people who actually marked PhDs. I think there were 4 who marked most of the PhDs in Australian history, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. And then, of course, marking the PhDs links into who gets the jobs. And in no time at all, you've got an academic profession which is quite easy to control in terms of the the people that are working in universities. And and of course, and then that goes to ARC grants. That's where I got really into trouble in the article, because he was on the ARC, of course, and I just simply pointed out the number of articles. The number of
grants that gone to Melbourne
his
College.
department. Now that was going very close to the wind. I admit that.
Yeah.
But I should have put this is not to say. I should have made an extra statement to say this is not to say. But I did not imply that he was being corrupt. I never made that implication. But it was meant to point out that when you look at the connections between things like PhDs, which I don't mention in that article, PhDs, ARC grants, appointments, it's very, very easy for a small country like ours for a academic discipline to be controlled by relatively few people. And this I thought was highly problematic. To put it mildly, because what it meant is that over time, whereas I think 50 years ago, the history discipline in Australia was relatively pluralistic, over about a period of 30 or 40 years, it narrowed. So that, for example, and again, this is sort of ancient history. McIntyre was a product of the Melbourne School of History. The Melbourne School of History, under Max Crawford, back in the 60s, where he was actually doing his undergraduate degree, its central unit that all the historians had to study was the English Civil War. And of course, we know what side the Max and the Melbourne historians were on, and it certainly wasn't the monarchy. And so, in a way, what happened was that there was a sort of, this thing that we are on the side of social progress. We're on the side of social progress.
Yeah.
And the other thing that went with that was that the Melbourne people saw themselves as far more professional than the Sydney people. Right. They saw themselves as being the professional historians. People who came out of other parts of Australia were poorly trained. So when I turned up in Melbourne in the early 80s, I was told, you've come from the inferior Sydney. These things.
I can't imagine anyone thinking Melbourne was superior to Sydney.
Well, they certainly
I know this narrative exists.
And again, it's to do with Sydney Melbourne intellectual history.
I know.
And there was a famous art. There was where the Melbourne people were far more likely to produce social progressives. they believed that they were going to change the world. They were more professional. It was really interesting. And Max Crawford, who was the professor, he set out to sort of conquer the rest of the history profession in Australia. So what happened over time was the old pluralistic traditions slowly became more bureaucratized, more professional, and more interested in social issues than had previously been the case.
Well, speaking as someone who holds a lot of progressive positions on social issues, I have found it incredible how in Australia, people who hold professorial chairs, who are deeply embedded in government policy making, who have a monopoly of the mainstream media, who appear on the ABC, who write articles for the quarterly essay and the monthly and such, how they believe, and they seem to sincerely believe, that they are the beleaguered outsiders. Speaking, and the phrase I love is speaking truth to power. And I always want to say, whose power? Haven't you looked in the mirror? It's incredible to me.
I think that's because they have a mindset that they're still in Menzies Australia, and that they're still the beleaguered. This is obviously not the case in these sorts of things. But you see, I was taught by John Manning Ward at Sydney. He died in 1991 in this most absolutely terrible way. He was in a train and another train rammed into it. But he was Vice Chancellor at Sydney up till then. And he openly described himself as a liberal conservative. Nobody today openly describes themselves as a liberal conservative. These sorts of people, the tragedy is that the pluralism has been washed out of the system. And what you get is a sort of groupthink sort of mentality. Right. I'll give you an example. This will get you. There was some people in education here doing a project on creative thinking in history, physics, and poetry. Mm-hmm. And I got contacted, and they said, "Well, we've already done the project, but the problem is that all the historians that we've interviewed seem to have the same views. So we need someone who doesn't have those views."
That's how I got on the ABC.
I thought, that's interesting. I mean, is this if someone's got an email that sort of says, there's groupthink amongst historians?
Well, at least
it basically says that.
At least someone made the effort. Look, Christopher Carr asked, was the key point of the so-called history wars really about the rules of evidence, about what should count as historical evidence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been about what counts as historical evidence. And as I said, the part of the problem is that it isn't just about evidence, I think, because the evidence can often be it's reading the evidence and imposing certain interpretations on the evidence. And I think it's also about, at least from one perspective, a desire to push a moral agenda as if that is what history is all about. Study of history isn't about a moral agenda. It's actually about what happened in the past. And I think, to be fair, with someone like Keith Windschuttle, he wasn't interested, he wasn't pushing a moral agenda. He was saying, well, let's look at the evidence. Now, that's a traditional history way of doing things. You can only draw conclusions. So it wasn't about, it got portrayed as whether Australian history was good or bad, but that's there are good bits of history, there are bad bits of history.
Right.
you going into some sort of moral absolutes about history isn't going to get you very far.
There are two related problems here, as I see it, though, and they're kind of in tension. But let me just lay them out. I mean, one is, should academia be politicized? Now, we're used to the arts and social sciences being politicized, but now we've seen even epidemiology be politicized. Epidemiologists who give an opinion that's opposes, that could be used politically by one side or the other, suddenly being an Oxford or a Harvard epidemiologist is no longer good enough. You're blocked from YouTube because you're spreading disinformation, right? So we've had this question of should academia be politicized? But then there's an even kind of a secondary or a deeper question. I'm not sure which one it is. Why do so many academics have the politics they have? And so looking at the history wars, I've been asking myself as a foreigner here, why do Australian academics want to reshape Australia's history from being, the history of the English-speaking peoples in a foreign climate, to being a history of Australia, the continent, on which English-speaking peoples are a late and unwelcome intruder? And why do they want to change that narrative, despite the fact that they are almost entirely the descendants of English-speaking intruders on this continent? So why do they want to shift that narrative in a way that ultimately, if drawn to its logical conclusion, devalues them? That is, they shouldn't have professorial chairs in history. They shouldn't be the authorities they claim to be. Aboriginal knowledges are supreme. So, why are we letting a white professor of history tell us about Aboriginal knowledges? Abolish the history department and bring actual Aboriginal storytellers in to tell us the story.
My thing on this is that it's to do with the transformation of Australia in the second half of the 20th century. So two things happened in the second half of the 20th century. The first was that the links with Britain were broken, largely in the 1960s and 70s. And although, and it's a big pity that one of the things Australian historians never properly deal with is, what are the consequences of the end of empire? Actually, the consequences of the end of empire are quite profound. So they've got to work out what's the narrative that fits with that. The second thing was the growth of tertiary education and a much more highly educated population. And again, if you go back into Australian history, Australians were generally not well educated, and universities were sort of very strange sorts of institutions that didn't really have a lot to do with the rest of the country. This was the case right up well into the 1950s. So I think what one of the things that comes out of that, and I was reading a new book on Morrison by Sean Kelly. He's not a professional historian, but he sums up what I think perhaps the issues are here, where he gets stuck into the old Australia, that's to say the Australia of the first half of the 20th century, and finds it totally worthless. In other words, he says, we had no culture, we didn't have anything, we didn't, we were just a sort of rubbish. Now, that's interesting because 1922, 100 years ago, an English novelist by the name of D.H. Lawrence visited Australia, stayed just up the road from where I am at the moment. He said exactly the same about Australians. He said they were all worthless, sort of no spirit, they were corn stalks. And no, this is interesting. So I think that the new educated Whitlamite elites from the 1970s came to despise what had been the Australian culture out of which they themselves had come.
Right.
And so having said that old Australia was worthless, they had to search around for something else. So when I read this to Sean Kelly, I thought, this is an act of self-hatred. They hate themselves for they hate Australian culture for what once was. Now, Australian culture before the 1970s was not a high culture, but there was a fellow by the name of Len Hume that probably no one knows these days, wrote a book about the cultural cringe, where he pointed out that Australians actually had a vibrant popular culture.
Right.
It was a vibrant popular culture, but that popular culture, it's a bit disgusting to have that, isn't it, as the basis of your culture?
That's what we have in America.
So what do?
Pop culture is American culture.
Love the new immigrants because, hey, they're much more cultured than you are. And, of course, you look for an authentic Australian culture, and it can't be what it was before. Oh, no, it has to be Aboriginal culture.
Right. So
a lot of it, I think, comes out of the self-hatred of this new educated middle class that emerges, and particularly you find this attitude, it's not so much in the Liberal Party, you really do find it in the Labor Party.
Right.
There's a lot of Labor Party people who hold those sorts of views, that in fact Australia was just rubbish. It wasn't, and we just have to start all over again to get away from how awful the country was in the past. They ate meat and 3 veggies. They didn't have spices, and they didn't drink wine. They drank beer and all, and they didn't have good literature. They had things that were popular and that attracted people.
Let me just take a moment to plug my new book, Australia's Universities, Can They Reform? And spoiler alert, the answer is no. And you can find the website here at australiasuniversities.com. I had to go outside the country to get a website because you can't get in the .com.au domain unless you have an ABN. There you go, Australia. But the book's been covered all around the press, and I hope we can do a book launch soon. But in the meantime, I appreciate anyone who picks up a copy and lets me know what they think. Greg, I'm going to offer maybe a different explanation to the cultural cringe explanation. I keep wondering if this, let's just call it what it is, this Australia hatred among Australia's elite intellectual class, if a lot of it isn't connected with the Republican movement, with the idea that, like the only way to assert Australia's independence, if you will, its full independence, not just its legal independence through, getting rid of the Queen and the monarchy, but its full independence is to somehow devalue its connection to the UK. And I say that, I guess, as an American, where, in the US, we have that narrative of the, Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, and we unashamedly tie American political institutions back to England, the common law, Magna Carta. There's no shame about the idea that the Pilgrims came from England. If anything, it's a point of pride. Winston Churchill is one of the most adored figures in America. There's not that nervousness about it. That in Australia, I wonder if, having never broken with the mother country, when the U.S. went to support the United Kingdom in World War I and World War II, it was a choice. It wasn't because, well, of course, as part of the empire and then later part of the Commonwealth, Australia must enter the wars, right? Fight. So, and I ask this question because I've also seen, not just in the history wars and this treatment of Aboriginal history, but the narrative emerging around Anzacs and Anzac Day, how somehow it was a worthless sacrifice of Australian lives, instead of, if you go back 70, 80 years, the Anzacs being the heroic Australians who marched into Jerusalem and who led the charge on the Western Front and defeated the Germans. Like there are these competing narratives of Australia, and I keep thinking it's all part of some kind of intellectual declaration of independence. Am I entirely wrong there?
Yeah, I just do a number of points. One is that all the people who say that Australia was not fighting its own war in World War I, most of them are probably not aware that New Guinea was a German colony. So the first thing the Australians did in World War One was to go up to New Guinea.
Oh, yeah, I agree. The narrative is factually incorrect.
It's incorrect. It's factually nonsense.
That's not the point. The point is, why do they want to promote this factually incorrect narrative?
Well, again, and this was in the piece I was talking about before, the Australian intellectual classes feel cheated that they didn't have a revolution. You know, and this is quite old. There was a book by Noel McLaughlin 40 years ago about why Australia didn't have a revolution. But why would they have a revolution? And despite the fact about, all the Aboriginal history wars and everything else that they're talking about, the main feature about 19th century Australia was how ordered and non-violent it generally was. So if you look at, there's Eureka, there's the Lambing Flats Chinese riot, which is the only time I think that the Riot Act was read in colonial Australia. And one of the reasons for that, what I postulate about that, is that Australians, the colonists, what they really wanted was respectability. They wanted order and respectability. And one of the reasons they wanted order and respectability was the convict taint. You had a society, remember, you've got a society, the European bit of the society, the British bit of the society, where huge numbers of people are actually descended from convicts.
There you go, knocking Sydney again.
Sorry?
There you go, knocking Sydney again.
No, I'm not knocking Sydney. I've got 3 convict ancestors. And that's not uncommon, I suspect, amongst the older Australians. This is what the thing. And the 19th century, they were, you read some of the newspapers and so on. Yeah. They want to be respectable. So compared to 19th century America, Australia was a remarkably non-violent place. I'm not talking about that. Leave aside the frontier and so on, but in the society more generally, it's just totally different to what America was like. And they were quite proud, I think, of the fact that they managed to get what they wanted without having to go to a revolution. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing from their point of view.
Yeah, or a civil war.
Or a civil war. I mean, where was the Civil War? And again, I mean, I've done stuff on the constitutional conventions, and they were like Americans before the revolution. Americans before the revolution in the 1750s, 1760s saw their freedoms as being British. It's only with the revolution that they moved beyond being British to universal. Because they could no longer claim British freedoms, liberties as the basis of their. And Australians never went that. They continued to think, well, we don't want. We are a British society, which they were in the 1890s. Therefore, we claim our liberties and freedoms on the basis of our British tradition. So they were really averse to universalizing. That's why there's no Declaration of Rights in the Australian Constitution. Nothing remotely like that. Because they didn't see they had a need for a Declaration of Rights. They didn't see there was a need for it. They trusted in their own community values to protect their freedoms, which is something which probably is a little bit, it's quite different to what Americans have in their.
Yeah. And Anthony wants to quote Orwell for us. Quote, within the intelligentsia, a derisive and mildly hostile attitude towards Britain is more or less compulsory, but it is an unfaked emotion in many cases. Is a derisive and mildly hostile attitude, maybe not even mildly, towards Australia, more or less compulsory in the Australian history profession?
Well, the Australian history profession is very interesting in that regard. I mean, why are they so concerned with racism, sexism, and various other forms of things.
Oh, I can give you the answer to that because it's fashionable in the U.S.
It's fashionable in the US, but it also
Yeah.
fits their perception of what their past was like. It fits their perception, and it's a really, I mean, there's really interesting things in this regard. Australian historians these days are far more interested in the colonial or early 20th century than they are in the more recent period of Australian history. There's basically nobody working on contemporary Australian history. Nobody does it. Nobody works on Australian political history, particularly of the non-Labor type. There's a whole range of areas that are simply out of mind within the academic profession. And I think
Australian history ended with the dismissal, I thought, and that was the end of it. The CIA, asserted its rule over Australia, and that's it. Australia's been a CIA colony since the end of.
Well, if you look at the national history curriculum, it's really weird. The narrative actually does stop in 1975, and then what they do, they move on to things like rights, environmentalism, movements, social movements. There is basically no narrative taught in Australian schools after 1975. It's bizarre. It's bizarre the way it's done. And the other thing is that the history wars back with McIntyre, with Blaney, with Manning Clark and so on, these were people who actually thought they should write histories of Australia. Nobody writes histories of Australia any longer. Nobody wants to write a narrative of where the country's come from and where the country's going to. The profession has become so highly professionalized, they just want to do their own little thing, their own little bit of the history. So it means we're not getting, it's not just that we no longer, we have the history. The history wars in this sense are over because nobody does it any longer. There's nothing to conflict over because nobody puts out a new version that other people can dispute.
Not with a bang but a whimper. I suppose you're just as likely to find someone in a history department in Australia today studying the history of post-colonial Paraguay as studying Australia. Is that not the case?
Well, I don't know. South American history, I don't know.
I didn't mean that specifically.
But you do get hyper-professional.
It was off the top of my head in case you can't see it. Yes.
You do get hyper-professionalization, as you probably get in sociology as well.
Of course, yeah.
Where people just study very, very small topics. And
very few people in my department are studying Australian society. It's just not our remit. In fact, if I can again promote Australia's universities, can they reform? It's a bit of an exception that I would write an entire book as a sociologist based in Australia, that I would write an entire empirical book focusing on Australia is a bit odd.
I'll tell you a story of what happened to me only about 5 years ago. A former student who's now Zach Gorman and I wrote a book on, wrote an article, on Menzies' memoirs, longest serving Prime Minister, and Howard's memoirs, second longest serving Australian Prime Minister. We sent it off to, first of all, the Journal of Politics and Australian Journal of Politics and History. Then we sent it to the journal, when it was rejected, to the Australian Journal of Political Science. And in both cases, the editor refused to send the article out even to referees. Right. And the reason they gave was because this was a boutique topic. And even though we study Australia, that's no longer our prime reason for being.
Right.
So if the Australian Journal of Political Science is no longer interested in something I think which is fairly significant, which is the memoirs of its two leading prime ministers, then why the hell, what is it interested in?
And who are also, I mean, and I don't say this to flatter, who are also global figures. I mean, both Menzies and Howard are Australian politicians whose names would be recognized in the US,
Yes.
UK.
I think what
They're
we
not
were
obscure
meant to
figures.
do was to go transnational and add an overseas figure. So you would then have to add, if you wanted to do Howard, you would have to add Tony Blair. If you're going to do Menzies, you had to add some English politician. Right. Transnational bio is a really interesting term, by the way, because what it really means is other parts of the English-speaking world. They're not actually interested in the rest of the world. They're only interested in New Zealand, Canada, America, and Britain. So their idea of the world is fairly restricted.
So, as most things academic, it strikes me that the history wars, having begun in the universities, have trickled down to the schools and the colleges and down to the elementary schools. And even if maybe academic historians in Australia just shrug their shoulders at it at this point, it's entering the collective conscience through the kindergarten curriculum. I mean, because the history wars seem to me, I mean, I was surprised to hear that there was a history wars in the, not surprised, but it was news to me that there were a history wars in the university history departments 30 years ago, because the history wars to me was a term that applied to fights over the national curriculum.
The national curriculum to us. I mean, by the time the national curriculum came along, which interestingly enough, it started under a Labor government, but there were not there. I mean, I did a critique of the history national curriculum in 2014, and I pointed out all sorts of problems with it. And of course, this was as part of a review. Of course, no notice was taken of anything I said, which is what you expect. So you go and look at it again in 2021, last year, and it's still got the same. The part of the problem there is it's become entrenched in the bureaucracy. It's entrenched.
Well, that's what I mean. So the received notions, the things people are taught in university classes that they half remember, because let's face it, they didn't get 100% when they were at the university, and then they've forgotten half of it by the time they're in these positions. They just become vague received wisdoms that then get written into
white man bad. White man bad. That's what they remember.
Yeah, well, yeah, that fits in with
the self-hatred.
Yes, and so that headline narrative becomes the narrative, which is just, well, it's unfortunate. It happens all the time. I mean, even science curriculums in schools are usually endorsing the consensus science of 30 or 40 years previously. They're not necessarily up to date in any way. But, with history, this seems to have a special place. It's not just, we're not just teaching students incorrect physics that they will forget anyway, and they're never going to use in their lives. We're molding their preconceptions about the society they live in. And in a democracy, that seems to have particular salience.
Yeah. Although it's hard to know in the long term, as you say, how much do you remember about what you learned at school? What sort of things do you actually remember? So it may just go over their heads. I don't know. It's hard.
Well, it's hard. Look, I'm sure they don't remember the date of a particular supposed Aboriginal massacre, or even where it occurred, or who did it. But they will remember the vague notion. Oh yeah, white people came to Australia and massacred all the Aboriginals, and that vague impression will stay with them through life. No matter how much later, like the work that I've seen published on the massacre map, in Quadrant, such, no matter how much later careful scholarship disproves the facts on which that narrative was based, the broad narrative sticks.
Yeah, the broad narrative sticks. It's not the narrative that sticks; it's the moral attitude that's.
World War I was a useless, senseless waste of life, and the Germans should just have been allowed to run over Europe. The Japanese. I even heard, and here I'm going to use the term advisedly, academic historians, but young ones, talking on the BBC about the United States being responsible for World War II in the Pacific because the U.S. hemmed in Japan's need for growth and living space. And I thought, how can you say this, 30-year-old new PhD? Are you crazy?
But are they saying that, or because the U.S. cut off its access?
Yeah, because the U.S. cut off, had an oil embargo, which was sparked by the Nanjing massacre. And yet, this 30-year-old new PhD who got on the BBC because of being a 30-year-old new PhD, this person was not making a strong case that America started World War II. He was presenting it as received notion that, because that's what he'd learned. The U.S. was choking off Japan, so Japan had no choice but to strike back. So these broad notions, even among people who should, people have PhDs, never mind people who were half paying attention in class while flirting with someone and making plans for that weekend, or maybe going out on a climate strike. These notions become.
You mentioned powerful. Climate strike. I mean, climate strike fits in with the history stuff because it's about self-hatred. We're to blame for all the evils of the universe. We're to blame for the climate. We're to blame for the history. We're to blame for everything. We can't do anything right. It's almost as if we have a monopoly on original sin.
Well, there's something very Calvinist about wokeism, but I do have to show a comment. I think there's a misspelling here, but Anthony says, does it take foreigners to appreciate Australia's remarkably peaceful history? I'm thinking of, and I think he meant to say Salvatore Babones, but I don't know who this Claudio Veliz person is.
Oh, well, no, I think Jeffrey Blaney has that sort of appreciation. When you look at his work over an extended period of time, I think he does. I think that's. But then he's sort of,
Yeah, I mean, talk about a New Jerusalem, land of milk and honey. I mean, Australia is about as good as it gets.
I don't know about a land of milk and honey, but
okay, a land of wine and and mangoes. But I mean, I have to say, coming here from the U.S., even though the U.S. is richer, more technologically advanced, more efficient than Australia, what a wonderful place to live here in Sydney. It's no contest.
If it is a land of milk and honey, then that's because even though it's a big country, we don't have a large population. If we had a population the size of America, I wonder what it would be like.
Yeah, I do criticize Australians for not turning Alice Springs into either a gambling resort or a golf resort on the model of Las Vegas or Phoenix. I think it shows a gross failure of imagination.
Gross failure?
Yeah, it could be done. You just have to make it happen. But before we go, Greg, I saw on your profile, and I haven't read your articles, I do apologize, that you've recently been working on populism in Australia.
Yeah, well, I did. I haven't. That was a few years ago. I haven't done much on populism. I mean, I wrote on populism in the 1990s in Australia.
Right.
So I've looked at that for a number of it's not a new interest. It was an older interest.
What do you think of populism in Australia? I mean, is there any? So I mean, I wrote a book about populism in America, and I viewed it very much. Well, I called it the populist purgative. That while it may not have strong ideas of its own, it sweeps away the ossified system that preceded it. And I'm a big fan in that sense of both. And people have a heart attack when I say this. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, not as human beings, but for what they did.
I think the thing I'd say about populism in Australia is, compared to America and other places, it's actually not as strong as you think it may be, for a whole variety of reasons. the Australian political party system is actually remarkably stable.
Right.
And the populism, you look at Hanson or you look at United Australia Party,
right.
they all struggle. They all struggle. They don't look like they're going to get the number of votes they need for a big breakthroughs. And you have to wonder, well, again, this may go back to this this sort of culture that Australia has, which everyone's been criticising of late, that it's conformist, this, that, and the other. But it's a culture that gives, I think, a preference to order over independence, which you may not like, but it does do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why populism isn't as strong as people would expect it to be. So populism emerged, at least in recent times, in the 1990s, not just Hanson and other people, in response largely to Keating, I think. But it's been now, since 1996 when Hanson was first elected, it's been 26, 27 years, and it's gone up and down, up and down. But it's, unless something happens at the next election, it doesn't seem to me that it's going to make a massive breakthrough.
So what's next for you in Quadrant or elsewhere?
Various things. I'm actually, one of the things I want to do when I've got time, I think that what's happened with the last couple of years is that I've got a project which I've done a little bit of work on, but I've put it aside for one moment, that reinterpreting Australian political history in terms of emphasising how important the various emergencies have been in shaping the political culture and the nature of the politics. Because in the past we've tended to, we've assumed, there's this nice sort of things when nothing happened. Whereas in fact it turns out that just as COVID will have an effect, World War I had a massive effect. The Depression had a massive effect. World War II had a massive effect. So if we sort of turn our politics around slightly and say, well, let's focus on them and see how they shape the nature of the political structure, I think we might end up with a more interesting and realistic history of Australian politics.
Well, thanks for that. And let me take a moment just to thank Quadrant Online and Roger Franklin, editor there, for promoting this show. There's the promotion on Quadrant Online. I don't just write for Quadrant. I also subscribe to Quadrant. I read every issue front to back, and everything in between. And I know that Greg, you write for Quadrant pretty frequently as well. I'd like to encourage everyone to consider getting a subscription. I mean, don't just read the website, but also take out a subscription. I think it's well worth it. I mean, as that foreigner in Australia, Anthony, mentioned, I have found the level of intellectual, the level of intellectual discourse, sorry to use that term, on Quadrant to be extraordinary. I mean, I have been really impressed with the discussion there, and that's what made me really want to join it. I hope many of you will also. Greg Melleuish, thanks for today. Much appreciated. People can find your article on Quadrant Online. The link is in the description on this YouTube video. And much appreciated. Thanks for giving us a whole hour this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
You can find me next week here on the Professor's Podcast. Please tune in then. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah.